This week's show brought to you by a new Pokemon Raider. I haven't looked into it at all. I really should have thought this through. We about to go. Okay. Failed that, Brian, but you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. Actually, I've had a problem with that expression.
Yeah, me too. Well, it doesn't take efficiency into account, does it, Dre?
0 over 0 is the problem, right? They say you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. I believe anything divided by 0 equates to like not a number, infinity, whatever. So I don't think that works, although I think there is stuff online. But it's not 100%. That expression is wrong. And I also don't know. It always gets credited to Wayne Gretzky, but I don't know if that's actually correct. But anyway, welcome back to another Boxscore Geek show. We had a nice, long, rambling intro there. This week we're going to talk two of our favorite things, why the Hall of Fame is bullshit. The Naismith in this case, although most Hall of Fames are bullshit. And then we're also going to talk the Anthony Davis rumor mill, which I'm going to call it like it is, Brian. This is very much mainstream media with Trump. We're getting played, but this is sports and it doesn't matter, and I don't mind getting played. And then I'm going to get to be a hipster and act high and mighty and explain to you how we're getting played. So it's not an entire loss. Anyway, let's do some of the normal Box Score Geek Show stuff. We're going to talk comments from some of our pieces in the last couple weeks. We're going to talk some discussion of things around the NBA, including your Warriors, Brian. They've got some fun stuff going on, some of our favorite players, and then we'll get on to our topics. I'm your host, Dre Alvarez, known almost everywhere as Nerd Numbers, including chess.com, by the way. If you are a chess player, I am on chess.com. I've been enjoying it. I'm right around 1,500 according to chess.com, between 1,400 and 1,500. Chess.com says I'm in the 82nd percentile of active chess players, so maybe I'll get myself up to 90% at some point. But
Good job, Dre.
If you're on chess.com, you can follow Nerd Numbers. I enjoy playing there. I enjoy playing in the tournaments. So that's been enjoyable. And then co-host Brian Foster, you can find everywhere as Box Score Brian. Say hey, Brian.
Yeah, what's going on, Dre? And we're here on January 28th, and Anthony Davis mania has descended. There's been rumors for months that he may seek an out in the New Orleans Pelicans, and it's happened. He said he's not going to re-sign a Supermax deal there. So the speculation has begun. And as we like to say, it's an announcement of an announcement, and I know you don't like those, and I don't really either. But I think we can make an exception here just because it's Anthony Davis. And I want to talk a little about this too, but he is a generational talent.
Well, I also want to get into the meta commentary on that, and then, of course, do what I always do, which is get political so you and I can go 3 hours talking politics. But anyway, let's do Last Week on Lost. We actually got a couple of really good comments on our last week's show. So KS47 had a question on Blake Griffin. So here's the issue. Blake Griffin, according to us this season, is a slightly below average big. There are a few things. There's one.
We want to read his question out first?
Oh, yeah. Why don't you go for that? Read the question.
Yeah. We've got it. So what he says is Blake Griffin is now averaging 26 points per game on 60% true shooting and is still considered a below average player per the metric. His WP48 has gotten worse as his efficiency has increased. I'm not a fan of his game. This is the second post now by KS47. I'm not a fan of his game, but an explanation of the latter would be good. And we had a follow-up 3 days later on the same thread from Simon talking about his rebounding and turnovers. And anyway, so that's the question. I'll let you get into it.
Okay, and actually, let's do Simon's really quick because I like the point Simon made too. I just want to give this shout out before we move on to Blake Griffin. Paul George is playing amazingly this season. I was enjoying the fact that he has slowly surpassed Kevin Durant as the season's gone on. They're both very good players. We have no problem with Paul George starting the All-Star game. I don't know. I didn't put Kemba Walker on the script, but maybe we'll talk him in a minute. But anyway, so essentially, Paul George is just playing great, and we agree. And we didn't see this coming. I think beginning of the season, I was saying it was probably good for the Lakers that they didn't sign him because we thought he was a good player. Let's be clear. We thought Paul George was a very good player, but we kind of said he was, in his prime. So what you see is what you get. He was going to be expensive. There might be better stars like Kawhi, maybe Anthony Davis. We didn't know, so we were like, they're probably safe. But at this point, especially with LeBron James out, if they had gotten Paul George, especially if it had cost them, like Kuzma and Ingram, the Lakers could be basically, instead of fighting for a playoff spot with an injured LeBron, they could be a contender. So that definitely would have been interesting. He is playing great, and we agree. Like the numbers back it up. I've said players like this, situations like this are my favorite because even like Donovan Mitchell is an example. The other night he had like a 30-point game. It's not a good game. We say his numbers are really bad this season. I commented on it in a backhanded Midwestern compliment way, where I said Donovan Mitchell is not playing well this season. And he was nowhere close to the Rookie of the Year debate. I mean, even if you put him on the list, which is fair, he was so far below Jason Tatum and Ben Simmons last season that he had no place in it. The fact that he got second runner-up is just bullshit. I commented on it, but I actually said at the end, as I said, the funny thing is, I tried to argue that the Nuggets won the Trey Lyles trade for him, and we didn't. Trey Lyles looks like garbage. As I noted, we'll probably get to some Kenneth Faried. Trey Lyles was one of the bigs that we picked up that meant there were no minutes for Kenneth Faried, so we let Kenneth Faried walk. So the Nuggets, in spite of me saying that Donovan Mitchell is overhyped and overrated still, we lost that trade, which is kind of hilarious. And I still got some Donovan Mitchell hate, but we're not on the same boat as people in that regard on the Donovan Mitchell. But Paul George, people are like, he's amazing. He's better than Kevin Durant. He deserves to all the All-Star game. He's an MVP caliber player. And I'm like, yeah. I'm like, yeah. It's fun to hear. But what I was going to say is that actually relates what I was saying about Donovan Mitchell. As we talk about Blake Griffin, one thing about him is he's actually improved the last couple seasons. He's had some injury problems, but his adjusted production per 48 is 319, which is the best it's been since 2017, and we still say he's a below average player. Now, one thing that we have talked about a lot, and we're just going to keep talking about, and we'll see what we do about it, Brian, is a couple years back, I made the decision of changing up how we at the Boxscore Geeks calculate the wins produced formula. The wins produced formula, as we've mentioned a billion times, and we do feel is important and is a differentiator compared to other mainstream metrics, is we adjust by position. And this, by the way, is what baseball does. Baseball has wins above replacement. We essentially do the same thing. Wins produced could really be renamed wins above average. And what we did back in the day is we compared to average point guard, shooting guard, small forward, power forward, center. And what we would do is like go to Yahoo, look at what they calculated players as their listed position. Then we would also do an algorithm adjustment, which we still do, where we basically make it so that every position has an even number of minutes in it: point guard, shooting guard, small forward, power forward, center. And we do like a kind of a naive metric that we couldn't prove with play-by-play data, where we look at a player's height and BMI. And so that's how we make a decision. And so as an example, sometimes things get wonky where, say, Kenneth Faried might be classified as a forward, and say another player might be like Paul George might be classified as a forward, and Paul George might get called the power forward. We've had a couple edge cases like that. For the most part, we think it works pretty well. What I did a few years back is I combined the shooting guard and the small forward and the power forward and the center, and said bigs are their own thing. They're near the hoop. Wings are their own thing. They're on the perimeter. And then we just have to accept the fact that at least in the modern NBA and back as far as the beginning of the NBA, there has been a player whose job it is to hold the ball, come up the court, and distribute it, the point guard. And that is different. They're a perimeter player, but their job is to hold the ball, and that impacts their assists. So you really do have to factor in point guards. So when we combined power forward and center, one thing that people have noted is centers are just much better than power forwards. Players that are designated as a center just tend to be much better at shooting efficiency, much better at rebounds. And so one thing that's possible about Blake Griffin, the easy out, is he might be a little above average if we separated power forward and center again. And I'm going to have some discussions with Patrick and Dave Barry. And of course, if we do it, we'll make sure we have a post about it, and it's very easy to follow the steps. But there's been some discussion about that. But regardless, even if you did that, Blake Griffin would still be close to average. He'd be a little above average, but close to it. And the more key point there I want to give you is that, yeah, his true shooting efficiency has gotten great. Now, thanks Simon, who was noting other things. If you look at Blake Griffin, at his peak, when we actually thought he was close to, I don't want to say star, but good player, like 2014 with the Clippers, he was averaging 12.7 rebounds per 48. When he was a rookie, he was above 15. This season, he's at 10.7. And something else that's interesting, that the wins produced metric does that the other mainstream ones don't is it does factor in your team rebounding rates. So if you get a lot of defensive rebounds, Blake Griffin's offensive rebounds have dropped since his peak. Offensive rebounds, we accept that about half of the time, those should go to your teammates. So if you get a lot of defensive rebounds, which are a majority of Blake's rebounds, we factor in your team for that. So that's one of the issues with Blake. Also, his turnovers are up this season. So there are some basic things about his box score that explain why his production isn't as high as you would think with what we would call great shooting. But then what I want to get into on his great shooting is, if you go to the player comparison engine, so if you go to the tools tab on Boxscore Geeks, you are able to just type in Blake Griffin, and it will by default compare him to an average big. And so Blake Griffin, 60% true shooting, which is amazing. That is fantastic. Unless it's changed dramatically, Brian, the average big in the NBA, I believe, is around 58%.
We are bringing it up right now. Let's see here. We will go to the efficiency tab for Blake Griffin versus an average big. So Dre, this is really interesting. He is actually a worse 2-point field goal shooter than the average big. He is at 54.7 this year, and the average big is at 55.5.
But you know what really matters in the modern NBA that Blake's good at?
Threes. So he is better at threes than the average big.
He is. I mean, he is really good, right? He shoots better from three. He shoots a little better from the line, and he gets to the line about 4 times more per 48 than an average big. So,
but Dre, look at this though. His effective field goal percentage, that's really how good of a shooter he is, like from the floor, right? It only takes up free throws, basically. He's at 54.7%. What's an average big? 54.7%. He is a dead average effective field goal percentage shooter.
We've been talking this a lot about with James Harden, the basket doesn't care how the ball gets there. So that's why we like true shooting. He's about a 60% true shooter, which is really effective. But this is one of our pet peeves on the show all the time, Brian, this stupid modern small ball meme, right? The death of the big in the NBA. We love the Morey ball strategy of shooting, which we also call the Bop the Clown. So the strategy being you want layups and threes. If you look at an ideal shot chart, which we would call James Harden there's a big red dot right by the hoop, and there's like a smiley face around the perimeter. That's the ideal shot chart. Bigs, as we were noting, this is kind of one of the issues, are really good at shooting close to the hoop. And so that's one of the issues, because what I did here for fun is I looked at Blake Griffin, and what I did is I hopped back to 2014, the 2014 season, where we would actually call Blake Griffin an above average player, one of his best seasons. That season, the average big shot 54.6% true shooting. And this is just a standard topic that comes up in basketball and sports in general that we bring up all the time, which is there is inflation. It is a zero-sum game, which means it doesn't matter if Blake Griffin has gotten better than he was the last season, the last 2 seasons. If the rest of the NBA catches up, that hurts you. And, as I was already talking, Donovan Mitchell, one of my favorite subjects, what I'll say is if you look at the NBA, you can go season by season, and this is just a really fun game. So at Basketball Reference, this is something I like to do. You can go to just a season. My cat loves doing this. And there's a miscellaneous stats table for any given NBA season. And you can just sort by true shooting. And so, for instance, this season, true shooting percentage, 55.8%. If we just go back to, Michael Jordan, 1998, his last season, his last hurrah, and go to the bottom, go to miscellaneous stats. Oh, you can just click it from the top. It's very useful. Go to miscellaneous stats. It's terrible. 52.4%. So teams have just gotten better and better at their shooting efficiency. Part of this is taking more threes. Part of this is taking the right shot selection, right? As we're saying, layups are really valuable. So bigs are kind of learning, get rid of that mid-range shot. If you can't shoot threes, don't do it. So NBA players have gotten smarter. NBA players have gotten better. And as a result, even though Blake Griffin has improved with Detroit on shooting efficiency, we still think he's close to an average big because, one, his other stats just don't keep up with the other things bigs are supposed to do. And two, the NBA as a whole is getting better at shooting efficiency, which I know also makes it very confusing. This is why I really liked Paul George, because something we see sometimes, right, is I'm going to keep the Donovan Mitchell example. people will bring up Donovan Mitchell stats and compare to old players. We used to see this all the time with like Joel Embiid, right? They'd be like, Joel Embiid is putting up numbers we haven't seen since Wilt or since Shaq or whatever. And you'd go, well, if you look at Shaq's era versus Embiid's era, the relative difference of Shaq's performance to his era versus the relative difference of Embiid to his era or Mitchell to his era is way different. And so Paul George is an example, is a player that his numbers look spectacular compared to him back in the day, but then also relative to his position in the NBA look great too. Whereas Blake Griffin's numbers might look great compared to him earlier in his career, right? 26 points per game looks fantastic, but the NBA has gotten better enough where that marginal return just is not as much as we would like.
Oh, I love it, Dre. And you and Simon are starting to bring me around on this because I was a little, concerned initially. So let's go back to Blake Griffin on the Boxscore Geeks here. I'm showing his player page. And so here's another great example that proves the part you were just talking about, the inflation side of it, right? So 2018-2019, Blake Griffin's raw production per minute, his ADJP 48 is .319. His career average is .317. So this season, Blake Griffin's raw production is almost identical to his career average. However, his career average for per minute WP 48, so what that means is taking his raw production and then normalizing it for his position and for the league, right? Is his career average, he's above average as a player, .12 WP 48. However, despite his raw production being the same, he's substantially lower in WP 48 per minute this year, .083. So yeah, that's a big drop in, normalized production based on his raw production. And then before I let you get in, Dre, the second part I wanted to talk about, it was that position thing, right? Should we normalize the positions on Boxscore Geeks, and is that hurting him?
Center again.
Yeah. So should he be treated different than his teammate Andre Drummond, basically, right? Who's a true center, whereas Blake Griffin is a forward. He's more of a 3/4 than a 4/5, maybe, right? I don't know. Anyway, so what I did for that is, again, going to Boxscore Geeks, this time the players tab, all the players in the league. Let's look at his raw production this year, where he's considered to be a power forward, versus a small forward who has very similar raw production for him, right? And then look at the normalized stats. So he is, let's see, let's find him on this big list of players here. I brought it up. And we're gonna have to, here we go, Blake Griffin. So he's got this 4.0 position, whereas someone who's closer to, say, a small forward that's near him, right? Well, Kyle Anderson this season, who, by the way, I think is getting healthy again. He might be back in the lineup soon. His position is considered 3.5. So he is, on Boxscore Geeks, he's considered halfway between a power forward and a small forward. However, his raw production is almost identical to Blake Griffin. Like we said before, Blake Griffin is .319 ADJP per 48 raw production. Kyle Anderson slightly higher than him this season in less minutes, .32. However, he's not even a pure small forward. He's 3.5, right? That being said, his per minute WP 48 substantially higher than Blake Griffin's with the same raw production. He's at .158. Blake Griffin is at .08, almost twice as high per minute. So, yeah, the position is very substantial to me, Dre, it looks like. And then the other side of it, we were just talking about before. I already forgot what it is. Oh, yeah, the inflation. I think both of those are very substantial to what we're looking at here.
Yeah, and I mean, I still the reason I'm okay on the power forward versus center is we've had enough people note this, that players like, Clint Capella or Rudy Gobert or DeAndre Jordan, players that we think are some of the best in the NBA, if you look at players that are designated as a pure center compared to power forward centers, they are just much, much better. And the best players in the league, by the way, my cat just got her claw stuck on my pants, so that's what you were just...
Oh, kitty.
Okay. But, so anyway, they are just better. So I think this might be a thing where I bashed us before, the eggheads, where we're saying from a fundamental strategy, we don't think power forward versus center, there should be a difference. I know Patrick as a coach has said this too, right? You can just put one on either side of the hoop. No big deal if they can shoot threes, like Embiid, like Blake Griffin, no big deal. If they can't shoot threes, then keep them close to the hoop. But there does seem to be a difference, and I think that might just be the NBA. So I am actually leaning, after a couple of years of this, of going back to power forward versus center. And I mean, for what it's worth, the same players are still just going to look great, but you are going to have some players that were basically hitting a little harder, like Blake Griffin, that'll look a little better. But what I did like about you looking that up there is that, you're saying even if we call Blake Griffin a forward, just, 3.5, somewhere between a small forward and a power forward, he'd be a good, not great player despite doing this. But what's also like huge is, let's do exactly what I'm saying. So Blake Griffin, when was he a rookie?
Let's bring it up here. He's been in the league for a while now. So, and let's not forget he missed his entire rookie season injured. So the first season he actually played minutes was 2010-2011. He played 3,111 minutes.
Okay, well, actually, this works. This is amazing. Okay, so do you want to know a player that had the exact same adjusted per 48 ADJ P48 as him as a basically a shooting guard wing? James Harden in 2012 had a 317 adjusted 48. We'd call him a shooting guard. He was a star shooting guard, 241 wins per 48. That's over twice as good as an average shooting guard small forward. So it's like, yeah, I mean, depending on the position and year you're putting him in, you could really make the difference of his production this season being star level in the past. And that's what makes it really hard to compare players. I know that gets really confusing for people because you go, what do you mean Blake Griffin's below average this season? He's putting up numbers that are, right up there with, Matt Barnes. Yeah,
hey, Matt Barnes is really good on those We Believe teams and some others.
Well, I mean, actually, even just to what you're saying, right? Kevin KG with Boston, actually, though, he was below average back then. And then we're just saying, well, he's not great. He wouldn't be star. As a power forward that year, he'd be rated somewhere in the middle. But it just
Blake Griffin looks good compared to forwards, but he just doesn't look good compared to, say, his teammate Andre Drummond.
Yeah, and Andre Drummond's an interesting player as well. Let's do one last comment. This was from Chris Ye. Chris Ye said, yeah, we talked at last week's show and he agreed. Your guy, so I'm going to say Zubats. I know the last name. I forget the first name. I'll get that in just a second. But Zubats is your guy and has been really good. The other night, I believe Tyson Chandler was out and he played great. Now, what I will say, unfortunately, is another week where they're out late. We'll talk why in a second, but my box scores of the week, I couldn't get Zubats onto the list this week, but that's in part because one of your other guys, Brian Klay Thompson, scoring, I believe he went 10 for 11 from 3 in one quarter and had either the best game or the second best game of the week. Last week just had some fantastic games. Nikola Jokic had a great triple-double. James Harden went off again, as he's doing every week. Klay Thompson did great, so it's like I couldn't quite get Zubats onto the list, but he has been playing well, and Chris Ye has bestowed him as your guy, saying he's playing great, he's getting major minutes, and there was a 14-point win against, I'm not going to give much credit to Phoenix, but was key.
And, the only comment I have here is I actually want to explain this joke because we've been going on it for several weeks now, and I don't think we ever actually talked about what this joke means or why it's a joke. So the first time I ever heard this joke, it's probably been told way before this, was actually two very traditional guys, Tony Kornheiser and Mike Wilbon, who they would just call everyone they talked about on their son the other guy's guy. And this joke goes back to basically the beginning of sports talk radio, from what I can tell, like in the 80s and 90s when I started listening to it anyway, where it's all tribal, right? And you have to just say either this guy is on my side or he's on the other side, right? There's no nuance like we're looking for here with Blake Griffin's statistics. You just have to either be all in or all out. So someone's either your guy or not, right? Wilbon and Kornheiser made fun of that all the time, and then we are here. Like, obviously we all have, whatever medium thoughts on Zubats, but calling him someone's guy, that's a meme from Sports Talk Radio.
Gotcha. And I hadn't even used it that way, but I love it. Okay, well, let's get to some of our Around the NBA. Speaking of our guy, this was funny. Kenneth Faried, as I mentioned, has looked great in Houston. Pre-show, we noticed, and I tweeted out about this, he's now played more minutes for Houston than for Brooklyn this season. Brooklyn paid him $14 million. Houston's paying him the minimum. He's looking great for Houston. We like Mike D'Antoni as a coach. I'm so excited about this. It's funny to your point about, tribal versus your guy. I've actually been a fan of players over being a fan of teams. And where I've run into trouble with the Nuggets, as I've mentioned before, is I just can't quit them, and I've wanted to quit them before, but they have just had, at least since I got back into them. So I got into basketball because of Dikembe Mutombo, who was an amazing player, one of the best in NBA history for the Nuggets. Then they were bad for a while. I got out of favor. But then with Carmelo Anthony, or so I thought, they got good again. And then you discover, looking at the stats, it was really Andre Miller and Marcus Camby. I love both of those players. And then, of course, Marcus Camby gets traded away for nothing, but they've got Chauncey, and so does Andre Miller, but we get Chauncey Billups, and love Chauncey Billups. And, then things start to fall apart, but then they pick up Nikola Jokic, and then Nikola Jokic is one of my MVP candidates. So I am a fan of players. And so Kenneth Faried, I was even saying this back in the day with the Nuggets, where I was going, I would just rather him get traded to a team where he can get minutes and compete than be on the bench for the Nuggets, even if I thought that might hurt the Nuggets' winning chances. And that's the situation. I mean, he is looking great in Houston. And to something we've talked about with positions, what's fascinating to me is I kind of think that, especially given some of the outside shooters like James Harden and, yes, Eric Gordon, that when Capella gets healthy, they should probably just play a front court of PJ Tucker, Kenneth Faried, and Clint Capella, and that's really powerful. And I don't care who's the small forward there. That just seems really good to me. So Faried looking good in Houston, excited to see it. He's like a double-double machine there under a good coach. So shocker, you were pre-show, you were saying, Brian, like the least surprising thing in the NBA this season. Kenneth Faried looks good on a good squad. Shocker.
Yeah, the only reason we haven't been railing against, why hasn't some contender tried to liberate Kenneth Faried from Brooklyn is because it'd be like beating a dead horse. I mean, we love Kenneth Faried so much on this show, and no, he's not a prototypical, stretch four or whatever you want to call players these days, but he does everything, right? He rebounds like a center despite being very small, and I guess they're playing him at center right now, but like you said, they should move him to power forward when Capella gets healthy. Blocking shots, stealing the ball. I'm sure he's probably shooting well too. I haven't looked yet. Let's see here. He's 59% true shooting. That's pretty typical for him. So he's just a great player. And I love the point you made just now that I hadn't considered before. If they can get Capella, Faried, Harden, Tucker, and Chris Paul, that's their starting five for the playoffs. That is ridiculous. Like, that might be better than what the Warriors can do.
Chris Paul and James Harden, like that's the funny thing. A lot of people go, well, my small forward needs to stretch the floor. I need a big that can shoot threes. And we go, with James Harden and Chris Paul, you can, James Harden is averaging 13 3-pointers a game. It's probably gone up since. He's taken close to 30 in a game, right? I forget what his max for the season. I really actually have to look that up because I know he has taken a ton. You don't need Kenneth Faried to shoot threes. You've got James Harden. You've got Chris Paul. Let them chuck up the threes, and Kenneth Faried can get every single Kobe assist on every missed one.
That being said, it is a big question mark, though, because the rest of their players are not very good, and to just get them there, to drag the team to the second round of the playoffs to the point where they can actually, assert those five players. That's easier said than done for the Rockets. But, man, that I guess what I said in the pre-show is right. Like, we were so unsurprised by this, and it's really dumb of all the other contenders to not try to get Faried.
Right. Another player that we like and also falls into that Blake Griffin point, DeMarcus Cousins is putting up his best raw production numbers of his career. Not quite as good as his peak levels because the NBA has gotten better, but is looking more than fine for the Warriors. We're not allowed to talk about tonight's game, but those of you out there can go look up the Indiana Pacers game and see how DeMarcus Cousins played. I'll just say, DeMarcus Cousins in Golden State is looking good. You were saying that you thought Steph Curry's performance is part of why their recent hot stretch. He's actually had some mediocre games in there.
Interesting. So maybe he's doing the Clay thing where he has really good games and kind of random ones.
I mean, Steph Curry is playing amazingly, but this team just is starting to get back there. I think DeMarcus helps a lot. And then of course, Klay Thompson, as I just said, had one of the best games of last week. I do still think that Klay Thompson is a major pothole for this squad. You really can't afford to re-sign him for what he's going to want, but at least him being close to his normal self is good. Draymond Green is at least as good as he was last year, which means you're fine for playoffs as long as DeMarcus Cousins
stays. Some local reporting on that, people are saying, like, yeah, he was not very good when he first came back from the injury, but lately he looks like the old Draymond. So let's see if his numbers start to tick back up as he gets healthier.
And I believe he's out tonight.
Yes, he rested tonight.
But I mean, this squad is in great shape, especially with how the West kind of cannibalized itself, although a couple teams I'd be worried about, the Denver Nuggets for sure if they can get healthy by the playoffs, and then of course the Oklahoma City Thunder, same boat. So, but we're happy to see that. We're happy to see DeMarcus Cousins looking good in Golden State. A rough one is Oladipo. This is one of the most fascinating trades where the Oladipo-Sabonis for Paul George trade. It's one where I don't know who wins it because it looked pretty obvious initially from our take that this was a winning trade for OKC because Oladipo had taken a step back and it was them getting out of a contract, and Sabonis had a bad rookie season. But now Sabonis looks like a star. Victor Oladipo looked like the most improved player. But then, as we're mentioning now, Paul George looks like an MVP candidate. So this is just really rough. It's a shame for Oladipo to be out. No timetable for return. He wasn't, as you were noting, wasn't having a great year. I don't think it was a super horrible year. Am I crazy?
No, he kind of reverted back to the way he was before the trade, just kind of like an average guy, not good or bad. But, I mean, if he was healthy, maybe he could have done better in the second half. And, of course, that's what they would have been hoping for. But
not great, yeah.
Yeah, so, yeah, it's funny. It's interesting you put it in terms of that was what the trade was, because a popular meme in NBA media, I think, is to say this trade was good for both teams, right? I think that almost never happens. Usually someone's going to get fleeced, at least on the process, right? And maybe, if the process was bad, things will still work out. But this trade, man, like all three of these players are just really good. So I think it worked out. And the one thing I'll say is they should somehow use this opportunity to start Sabonis or give him more minutes. Yeah. He's still their sixth man. I know they play different positions. I know he's like a power forward or a center and Oladipo's a shooting guard, but they got to figure out some way, to get Sabonis more minutes. He's their best player.
It's classic. I mean, that's always been something that we find amusing, is people giving a bunch of credit to coaches. This was like the Faried point. It's going, Faried's not getting him any minutes in Brooklyn. That's why we give so much credit to D'Antoni for saying, I don't give a fuck what that bad team was doing with a good player. Now I have him. I'm going to give him minutes. Like the San Antonio Spurs are very similar. Sabonis is not getting starters minutes. Nikola Jokic, now an MVP candidate, wasn't getting starters minutes way back in the day. Kevin Love on Minnesota. It's something we've seen a lot. And then what I loved about Blake Griffin at the start of the show is the numbers do basically say, you know what? Bigs in the modern NBA, a lot of why the offense is better is people taking threes, Morey Ball, Steph Curry-like players. But a lot of it is just bigs being really, really good at up-close shooting and getting smarter, right? Cutting out that mid-range shot and just taking shots close to the hoop and getting to the line. That's gotten much better. So, yeah, the lack of respect for amazing bigs in the NBA persists. We're going to talk a little bit about more about that. I got to give you a shout-out for this one, Brian, for finding this. You were saying Joe Lacob and the Patrick Picasso principle.
Oh, yeah.
This was a story from was it from Darren Ravel or someone else? I don't know.
I think it was Darren Ravel. Yeah, let's bring this tweet up here. So,
I guess so. Darren Ravel is reporting, but basically what he was told is Joe Lacob was asking to buy the Warriors, and I guess it's Chris Cohan. I hope I said it right.
Yep.
He said, what are you looking for? And he said $440 million. And Lacob said, I'll give you $450 million if we can get it done in 72 hours. The same point saying, as soon as you are offered a deal in the neighborhood you're looking for something like a Picasso, something rare that you have no shot at, don't barter, don't mess around, just get the deal done. I'm going to give a shout out. I'm almost done, Brian. I apologize to pass this to you, Chris Ye. I know you listen to the show. I'm almost done with blitzscaling. I was so close on my Audible, and then just over the Christmas holidays, I kind of got out of listening to Audible, and then hadn't even noticed. But I'm almost done. But I've been listening to blitzscaling, and that is a persistent theme in the book Blitzscaling by Reid Hoffman and Chris Ye, a fantastic book about growing startups and kind of the Silicon Valley mindset, which Joe Lacob definitely falls into, which is saying there are times when speed and getting to market absolutely trump being efficient. And the NBA, both in getting NBA teams, right? There are only 30 NBA teams, and there have been people that have wanted NBA teams. Steve Ballmer had to try 3 times, and by the time he finally got one, it cost him, $2 billion, somewhere near there, I believe. Whereas, I think obviously with Seattle, I think he tried to get some public financing and all that. And if he just come out and said, I'll pay for the stadium, I'll pay for the team, let's go, I think he probably would have gotten the squad. I think even the NBA couldn't. It was obvious the NBA wanted to move the Sonics to Oklahoma City and leave Seattle as an open market as a threat to other teams like the Phoenix Suns recently getting stadium financing. But obviously, had Ballmer come in with a deal that sweet, even the NBA couldn't have said anything, right? What are they going to say when he says, I'll pay for the stadium so the city doesn't have to complain? I'll give you more than Oklahoma City is offering for the team. They couldn't have said anything, but he didn't do that and didn't wind up with the team because it was negotiating. And so the Patrick Picasso principle says that don't try and finagle it when it's a rare good, or as blitzscaling book would say, a rare opportunity. And so this falls under that. And of course it works out for many reasons. I mean, I don't know if he was anticipating the growth of, say, gambling in the United States, but the Warriors are worth over $1 billion now. And even if the Warriors hadn't turned into a multiple title team,
they still would have been.
Still be worth, if we look at some of the worst markets, we look at the New Orleans Pelicans or whatever, they're worth it. So absolutely we give full credit for that point.
Yeah, and so we call it the Patrick Picasso principle, but just to spell this out, I think it was on one of these shows actually, Dre, and we were talking about some trade, and it might have been Kevin Love and Klay Thompson maybe. At any rate,
the specifics of it were the Minnesota Timberwolves negotiated with Kevin Love for his extension, and instead of giving him a full max for 5 years, they negotiated down to 4 years at the max. And then shocker, after 3 years, Kevin Love got mad, a la Anthony Davis, who we'll talk in a bit, and forced his way off the team. And Patrick said, when you have a star player, when you have a top 10 player in the NBA, you don't argue with them because you can lose out, just like the Timberwolves did on years. You just give them money and move on. And it was one of the points we made about, say, Giannis back in the day. When they signed him to the max deal, I said, there is nothing to be gained from trying to get a better deal. You'll save a couple $1 million in the best while pissing off a star. Yeah. Just give them the money and go on with your day.
Yeah, so what he said specifically, why does Picasso fit into this, right? And very well stated by you just there. But Patrick's example was, if you walk into an art gallery and you see a Picasso on sale for a certain price that you consider to be very, very cheap, let's say $440 for this example, you don't try to hardball with them and say, oh, let's say $400, I can get a better deal. No, you say, I'll buy it for $450, $10 more than you offered, because I need to get this right now for a good deal. That's more important than getting the absolute best deal possible, right? And so I'm skeptical of this story a little bit. This is just like Darren Rovell on Twitter, and this is coming from, Joe Lacob, who famously said the Warriors are light years ahead, giving him the nickname Joey Light Years. However, if it is true, this definitely illustrates the principle, and an incredibly smart move by Joe Lacob.
So actually, this is going to get me a tangent that I meant to have on the show topics a few weeks ago and was debating writing a piece about it. Kevin Draper, one of our favorite writers, was noting a anecdote that someone had about possible talks for trading for Steph Curry. And I'm fairly certain if you have a friend in a front office somewhere in an NBA and an analytics squad or whatever, they have some story about how they had a deal in the works for Steph Curry or Michael Jordan. Yeah. And they might be telling the truth, but I think a fun Moneyball story. So there is a series of posts, so they're never going to happen because I'm talking about them now, Brian, but a series of posts I've had in the back of my head called like the lessons people didn't learn from Moneyball, because the book's got a lot of stuff in it. And there is a great chapter in the book, and it's also a scene in the movie, where Michael Lewis is observing Billy Beane near the trade deadline on the phone. And, he calls up a squad and says, hey, I'm looking for this guy. I'll offer you this. And they say, I can't do that. And he says, well, here's what you do. You offer your front office this, we'll give them this, and then we can get you this player from this team. And he calls up the other team and is, I'll give you this and this for that player, but, this and this. And, it looks like an amazing set of negotiating and bartering, et cetera. But the postscript to that story is all of those teams said yes tentatively on the phone, either thought about it for a few seconds or went to their owners and then came back and said, nah, never mind. And I think that's really important in sports where we hear all these stories. One of my favorites, for instance, is that Phil Jackson wanted to move Kobe Bryant and thought he could get, I think, Sean Marion and someone else, maybe Jason Kidd, off of the Phoenix Suns at the time. Everybody's got stories like that where they got a deal, kind of a handshake deal or whatever, and then they say, but it fell through because my owner didn't give the go-ahead. But what I feel is really important to remember about those stories is, one, it's their memory. Their memories are inherently flawed. But two, a huge part of sports is people just back out or say no. And it is important when we hear these stories and these tales to kind of approach them with a bit of skepticism. Like I said, in Moneyball, it is a fantastic story. It is a great chapter. There's a reason it ended up in the movie because it is very cinematic. It lends itself greatly to being in a movie. But we have to remember that oftentimes deals fall apart for trivial reasons, and these things are hardly ever as close as people remembering them seem to think they are. So what you're saying about this story here, where it sounds great, it's like maybe it's possible. He just said $450 million, and Lacob said okay. Who knows? But
I'll give you a reason why it could be plausible, though, Dre, and that's because it's kind of a missing piece to the puzzle of the reporting of how the Warriors got sold. And what I mean by that is, Cohan was considered to be one of the worst owners, right? And the statistics say that's true. His team didn't win it all. He just made a lot of money. So maybe he's one of the best owners. He just made money for himself and screwed the fans. But that aside, though, right, the fans were not happy with him, myself included. So there was rumors that, for a while that Larry Ellison, the founder of Oracle, wanted to buy the team. I think he was doing the America's Cup, around the time, and he sponsored the arena that the Warriors play in now. For now, anyway, it's called Oracle Arena. So, and he was seen as a winner and a tech business leader. This was back in 2009, 2010, before the tech industry became the evil like they are now. So we were like, yeah, let's get Larry Ellison in here. He's a serious guy. He's the one who's going to get the team. And it was also rumored that, or reported anyway, that Larry Ellison had the highest bid for the Warriors, higher than that number that Lacob won it for. So this reporting from Ravel makes sense because we were thinking, why did Lacob's ownership group win this bid when they weren't the highest bid, right? That doesn't make sense. Cohan is known for being stingy and wanting to make money. Why doesn't he just take Ellison's bid and walk away and that's it? Well, that 72 hours thing might have been a big part of it, right? Instead of going on and on and on with Ellison, maybe he just wants to do the deal and be done. Now, it was reported that also at the time, I'll say that Ellison was maybe trying to strong-arm Lacob, and he's known as just kind of being an asshole anyway in the area. So maybe Cohan just didn't like Ellison personally, is one of the other rumors. But now we have a second reason why the Warriors might have been sold to Lacob.
And I mean, that is, basically speed trumps efficiency, because if he had offered a more logical thing, that also ends up in a funny boat, right? With Larry Ellison versus Lacob. I think Ellison has more money. I'm not 100% sure.
Pretty sure he does, yeah.
Even after the
because look how big Lacob's ownership group is, Dre. Like, there's Peter Guber, he's a Hollywood guy. He's like a close second, and it's a big ownership group.
Yeah, so that 100% lines up, and I mean that's we've even seen this. My example I bring up with the Kings is Vlade Divac saying that he basically just traded DeMarcus Cousins because he was getting frustrated. So there are times where you just swoop in and you make an offer quick, and a real this is a an appendix to the Patrick Picasso principle, which is to say, sometimes if you give them no excuse to say no, because that's one of the problems with classic negotiating. You ask for 500, I come back and say 450. You come back and say 475, and while we're doing that, this is what you're saying. Someone comes in and says, I'll give 525.
Yeah.
And now I have to start over, right? The things have reset because the price point has been reset. But if they say 500 and I say 525, they've got no place to go. They already said it. I've already trumped it, and so that works. So
Yeah, just think about like a classic auction house scene in a movie, Dre, where they're like, oh, $70, $80, $90, and then someone in the back of the room is like $300, and they're like, everyone's like, oh my God, gasp, you know?
You know, I apologize because last week I called her Annie McDowell. Her name is actually Andy McDowell.
Oh, the actress.
It actually happens in the movie Groundhog's Day.
Yes.
She bumps a bid, so you're right. Okay, let's get on to our two topics. We'll try and keep ourselves near an hour, Brian, a little over. I actually wrote a piece. I did write it over at Nerd Numbers. This is a funny twofer. I like the WordPress editing engine because nerdnumbers.com is in WordPress a lot more. That being said, there's a weird caching thing, so I had some typos in my first draft, and for whatever reason, they refused to go away despite the fact that the editor on the back end says that I've corrected them. So if you notice typos in the article, I did too. I've corrected them. I think there's some server-side caching on my web host that I have to fix. So we'll get to that. But anyway, so I actually wrote a piece, and I put it over at nerdnumbers.com today, and I called it Mariano Rivera and Why the Naismith Hall of Fame is a Sham. And the key here is Mariano Rivera, for those that don't know, I couldn't find this graphic, Brian, but I recall a few years ago there was an amazing infographic of his pitch because he had this amazing cutter.
Yes.
And the key for baseball batting is you cannot, there's a line, right, watch the ball all the way through. That is impossible. The way the best batters in Major League Baseball work is at some point, a couple, 10 or 20 feet in front of the pitcher after the pitcher has released the ball, the batter's eye sees the ball, in theory sees the spin. I've heard some batters say that, they see a red dot based on where the laces are. And they basically extrapolate. They say, okay, the ball is here. I know how fast it took to get there. I know what its spin looks like. So I'm estimating.
It's an educated guess, right?
Yeah, and then, of course, that's why it becomes really important if you could steal signs, because if you knew someone was throwing a fastball down the middle, you could say, I know where it's going to be, and I can swing about here if you know it was a slider or a curveball, et cetera. So that is key. But that is what the best batters in baseball do. They are making an educated guess as to where the ball is going to be and hitting it. Mariano Rivera's cutter, they all look the same. There's this spread. Like I said, I couldn't find it, which makes me bummed out, but there's this spread chart of all the places the ball ends up and what it looks like at that key point to the batter, and it looks identical. It was an amazing pitch.
Yeah, there's a term in baseball, Dre, effectively wild for that. Even if you have command, like it can go to different places, right?
And then this is one reason, like knuckleball pitchers are
yes,
because they're actually the funniest, where they don't know where the ball is going either. So that makes it harder. Is they throw the ball, and when it's there, you have no idea they don't know where the ball is.
They have their own private catchers because a lot of time the regular catchers don't want to catch a knuckleball.
Yep, absolutely. So, but Mariano Rivera is the greatest relief pitcher, and why I found this important is I've talked before about baseball versus basketball, and what I basically said is, this is my take, my controversial take, they are very similar. That in baseball, you have players most batters play both offense and defense, and play most of the game. The only reason a player like, say, Mike Trout is not as valuable to a baseball team like a player like James Harden is, essentially, if baseball were basketball, James Harden would be allowed to bat 4 or 5 times. Whereas in baseball, the most you're allowed to bat is 1/9 of the time. Now, then it gets a little different is where on defense, I guess you'd call it defense, you have pitchers. And pitchers don't pitch every game. And then it gets even more specific where you have relief pitchers, is what Mariano Rivera was, which is in certain games, close games, he comes in for an inning or two at the end of the game and essentially tries to get 7 or 8 outs. And it's really important because when you have a close game and it's near the end, you want a pitcher that's just impossible to hit so that the opponent gets 0 runs and you either win the game, that's a save, or you come back and get the win. And you keep the game close. And Mariano Rivera is arguably, if not obviously, the greatest player ever at this. I think he had 19 seasons. He had amazing statistics that are important for this WHIP, which is, I forget what that stands for, but it's basically adjusted
wins plus hits over innings pitched.
Something like that. So yeah, just it's walks, I believe, right? But it's
walks. Yeah, what did I say? Wins? Yeah, I meant walks. Sorry.
Essentially saying this guy was amazingly good at getting outs, which, as the book Moneyball looked at, as the book Wages of Wins looked at, are really valuable for winning. And he is the first unanimous player to get, or the first player to get a unanimous vote to Cooperstown, the Baseball Hall of Fame. And I was like, that's really fascinating because he's a role player. By every definition of the word, he has one job. He just pitches, right? He only comes in for specific scenarios. The comparisons I made in the article was actually against Derek Jeter. So Mariano Rivera, over almost 20 years, had 1,115 games for a total of 1,283.2 innings pitched, compared to an average starter, not an average starter, but a player like him, Derek Jeter. Derek Jeter suited up for almost 3 times as many games, 2,700 games. And then Andy Pettitte, who I called Any Pettitte in the article, I corrected it, but like I said, it's not going forward.
Oh, that's funny.
2,700.
Any old Pettitte will do here, Dre. Whichever Pettitte we can find.
2,796 innings. So again, 2.5 times as many innings. So this guy is a third as many games as a standard batter, is half as many innings as a standard pitcher, and yet nobody had a complaint with this. I quote Mike Greenberg. Another tangent, Brian. Mike Greenberg. I used to listen to Mike and Mike all the time when I had a conventional desk job and a 30-minute commute, and I would listen to him all the time. And I watched this clip of him where he's talking about Mariano Rivera and why it's egregious that he is the first unanimous Hall of Famer. No one disagrees that he should be a unanimous Hall of Famer. What they disagree with is like, how the hell wasn't Ken Griffey Jr., who's the most recent example, how the hell wasn't he a unanimous Hall of Famer? How the hell wasn't Babe Ruth a unanimous Hall of Famer? So I'm going to talk about why the NBA Hall of Fame is or the Naismith Hall of Fame, is messed up, but baseball's Hall of Fame is messed up, and they still make basketball's Hall of Fame look good. No one has a complaint with this, but he is, by all definitions, a role player. And then I said, well, Dennis Rodman and Ben Wallace are considered role players, right? Only on defense. I've heard the stupid line, which I never agreed with, which is the Pistons were playing 4-on-5. These were two of the greatest role players ever. And Dennis Rodman, despite leading the NBA 7 seasons in rebounding, back-to-back defensive player of the year, 6-time All-D player, he took 2 shots to get into the Hall of Fame. So it wasn't a question of, is Dennis Rodman a unanimous pick for the Hall of Fame? It's, does he even belong as first ballot? And they said no. And Ben Wallace, the question isn't even first ballot or unanimous. It's, does he belong in it all? Because he's still not in the Hall of Fame. And so I was looking at baseball going, I am so effing pissed at basketball, especially with how smug we get about advanced analytics and stuff in the modern NBA going, as long as we refuse to acknowledge the great defensive players that, by the way, the box score numbers agree were fantastic. As long as we ignore them, our Hall of Fame is bullshit. And so, for instance, like another player I brought up is Sid Moncrief, who is the first defensive player of the year, the first back-to-back defensive player of the year, one of only 9 players to win it multiple times, and one of only 7 eligible players to make the Hall of Fame. He is not in the Hall of Fame. That is bullshit.
And he was good on offense.
He was good on offense as well. The reason he might arguably not be in the Hall of Fame is because he was injured and had a shortened career, but he still had, I think, like 5 or 6 straight All-Star games. There's no reason he doesn't belong in the Hall of Fame. Another player that I won't give the NBA any credit, or not the NBA, the Naismith Hall of Fame any credit, is Chris Webber, who, interestingly enough, we would say wasn't as good in the NBA as his conventional wisdom would have you believe. But the Fab Five alone, his contribution to college basketball for the Fab Five alone, in my opinion, would dictate that him and the Fab Five, at least as a team, right, belong in the Hall of Fame, if not on its own. The fact that Chris Webber and Ben Wallace aren't in the NBA Hall of Fame just means it is a bullshit, irrelevant institution to me. Now, even if they get in, I still have complaints. For instance, they took forever to get some of the great ABA players into the Hall of Fame. Adrian Dantley, it took like 20 years, despite the fact that he was the greatest scorer in the 80s, like the numbers back. Like, yep. I'm talking conventional points per game numbers, say he was the best scorer in the 1980s. It took them 20 years to get in the Hall of Fame. So it's a bullshit Hall of Fame. But Mariano Rivera just like really rubbed it in for me going, they recognize a role player that's important for winning, and he got every damned vote. And we have comparable players like Ben Wallace, like Dennis Rodman. And not only did they not get every damn vote, they didn't even get close enough to make it in. And that is bullshit.
Yeah, well said. And no, I agree. You know me, right? I'm very, to use that word again, I'm very agreeable on social media. I don't get into a lot of fights with people. But when I do, it usually goes something like this. It's something like, some move in the NBA happens that I think, and I make a comment like, this is just yay points. They're going on points per game, and some things never change. And people say, how dare you? Of course we have analytics now. This is change. This is not yay points is not the reason why they did it. Well, I'll say that again here. I think it's still just all points per game. And despite Rodman and Wallace being efficient in their scoring, they just did not score enough to be liked by NBA fans.
And then to the yay points fact, like I said, the fact that Donovan Mitchell was second in Rookie of the Year voting last year, the fact that Kemba Walker, we'll talk this on another show, Brian, close to the All-Star game, the fact that he was an All-Star starter, I don't know, is it concrete yet, or at least that's just the most recent polls?
I think it's done. Yeah, it's done.
I think he's an all-star starter.
And he's been a really good player during the last few years, but he's a little bit down. He should not be an all-star starter.
The fact that he is an all-star starter over players like, let's see, I think Ben Simmons for sure. There are a few other players in the East.
But all-star starters is so weird because of the way they do it. Isn't it like 50% fan vote, 25% players, 25% media or something like that? So we had like Derrick Rose was almost an all-star starter, and I'll be fair to Derrick Rose. He has an amazing comeback year this year. Like I can't think of another player who has just been devastated by injuries for 5+ years and then actually comes back and is a decent player like he's been this year. So that's a nice story, but he should not be an all-star starter.
And then I actually have no complaint with this. They're like the same with Hollywood, with say Bryan Singer right now with the controversy surrounding him. I don't mind if you don't give accolades to people with severe off the court issues. And even if you want to go with the argument with Derrick Rose that he wasn't convicted by a jury of his peers, there is enough off-the-court stuff with things he said in testimony to just say, we never have to honor this guy with an award again. The NBA, if they wanted to, could say you don't get to play for us, but whatever. I have no problem saying I never want to honor this person with enough off-the-court baggage, and that's fine by me. So I would even put that with Derrick Rose. Let's get to our major topic. Said we're just getting spun like the media. This reminds me of very much mainstream media and Trump. So here's what happened. There was a Woj bomb this morning where he said Anthony Davis's agent has informed ESPN that they have informed the New Orleans Pelicans that Anthony Davis has no intention of re-signing with the squad. And for what it's worth, he still has a year and a half on his deal. So this is still a ways out, but he's pulling the power move of saying, you can trade me now and get something back, but be aware I'm out the door as soon as my contract's up. Yeah. And as a reminder for how things work in the NBA, Anthony Davis was drafted by the Pelicans, which means they held his rights for 4 years. They held his restricted free agency. And so that meant they got an additional 4 years off of him because of that max deal with it. I think they had like a 1-year player deal or whatever. So essentially, he has not had an option until this moment to say, I am not coming back. He's had to resign with the Pelicans. The only thing that could have happened would have been he said, I'm not going to resign. I'm not going to sign my max deal with you. I'm going to explore my options. A team like the Lakers offers him the max. The Pelicans match. He's back on the Pelicans. The only other option would be if he'd left $15 to $20 million, because I believe he was under the Derrick Rose rule, which is something like if you get like 2 All-Star starts, 2 All-NBA teams, or MVP award, you're eligible for 25 or 30% over 20% something for your salary. So he would have left a huge chunk of money on the table to not do it. So there's that. Now what I would say about this is that I find it very silly, because I called it high schoolish on the thing. It's Adrian Wojnarowski saying someone told someone to tell me to tell you this. And it is just the media getting played. This is Kevin Draper, again, he wrote a big expose on Adrian Wojnarowski back in the day, where Adrian Wojnarowski essentially traded being a mouthpiece for agents and teams in exchange for access. And there were many times where Adrian Wojnarowski would say things like, the Detroit Pistons are listed as a potential destination for this player. And really, he was doing PR for the Detroit Pistons by saying, I'm going to put their name out there to try and help negotiations. And that is obviously what is happening right here, right? This is not news. This is not a story. This is Anthony Davis using Adrian Wojnarowski to do PR, because in the NBA, you are not allowed to go out and negotiate before your contract's up. Remember, Magic Johnson got fined a bunch of money for tampering when he went on a late night show and said that he really liked Paul George. So that is what this is doing. This is a convoluted way of getting around a stupid rule that is archaic compared to other industries, which is to say Anthony Davis wants to start looking for new teams and is not allowed to come out on a podium himself and say, I'm not going back to the New Orleans Pelicans. I'm really interested in, say, the Lakers, the Celtics, and the Nuggets. I'm making those names up, by the way. He's not allowed to do that, so he's using Adrian Wojnarowski to do it. And like I was saying, very Trumpian, the mainstream media, because their currency is eyeballs, is saying, we know the story is going to get clicks. We know the story is going to get talked about. Like I said, we're falling for it ourselves right now. So they're saying, we're going to say this story for you because it gets media attention, and we're just getting played. But
and this might make you even more mad, Dre, but here's my favorite part of it. Wojnarowski is getting clicks for both sides of this, and here's what I mean by that. I don't know, we didn't talk about this before the show, so I don't know if you've seen this yet. He tweeted out again later in the day. So, yeah, like you said, that was an early morning, like 6 a.m. Eastern time, I think, tweet, right, that he put that out there. Now here at 3:02 Pacific for me, so that's 6 p.m. Eastern, right? 12 hours later, I guess, he says, NBA spokesman, and now he's quoting this NBA spokesman, we commenced an investigation this morning upon reading reports regarding Anthony Davis. That process is ongoing. Now he's not quoting anymore. This is Wojnarowski speaking in his tweet. One reason, an on-the-record request for a trade by an agent or player, Davis could be fined. So not only is Wojnarowski, getting all these clicks from the rumor itself, he's also getting clicks for the tampering related to this.
And I mean, he is, by every definition of the word, a middleman. He has inserted himself into, it's very much like Ticketmaster, right? People think Wojnarowski has the news. He is just doing high frequency trading on NBA news. He is getting 2 steps in front of it and then reporting it as if he's the source, where, like I said in Kevin Draper's piece, is noted, this information is going to come out, and in many times is going to come out with much less noise, because Wojnarowski in the past has added noise. He has added rumors like LeBron James is looking at the Knicks. I think he's going to the Knicks because maybe Wojnarowski is speaking on behalf of the Knicks. So this just gets absolutely ridiculous, but I do want to get on to the actual every mainstream blog publication is going to have. We're just going to wrap up and just say the Patrick Picasso principle. I was asked by Steve, I believe, let me get the name right because I want to get the person correct. But just the point about this being, wow, I tweeted a lot today, Brian, because I'm trying to go.
Good work.
No, I guess everybody was talking about Anthony Davis, so you have to talk about it. So it was Steve Fenn was asking me, what do you think are the best trade packages that are on the table? Are there any players, and he was basically saying, are there any players that you would exclude? And I think what I listed, let's see if I can remember. I think I said Doncic for sure, just because he's, as we were talking like last week, he's 19 and he's nothing. Third pick, that's so damn cheap. Ben Simmons is a similar example. Players like Giannis, players like Jokic, these are young players in their prime that are MVP worthy. But I think most teams, like if you can offer a player for Anthony Davis, you offer a player for Anthony Davis. The fun one I had in the back of my head is if you get some deal with like Draymond Green and Klay Thompson for Anthony Davis and, another salary to make it work, give that a go. And then I think I've had some people note the same thing, which is like every team in the NBA should at least give this a shot, right? I 100% agree with that point, because I don't think there is any deal. We were joking about this with Jimmy Butler, who we think is a much worse. We think he's a great player, but we also think he's a much worse player than Anthony Davis. When there were things saying like, all 4 of the Philadelphia 76ers first round picks might be on the table for Jimmy Butler, and people are going, wow, that's a lot. You're like, no, there is nothing that is too much for Jimmy Butler. It's the Patrick Picasso principle. There is nothing that is too much for a top 10 player in the NBA. For the most part, there are a few trades, and I said this before, where I've looked at this, and I don't think I've ever seen a case of this happening that did not involve injury, basically. There's never been a case of a top 10 player getting traded where it was not the right move to trade for that top 10 player, at least in the short run. So, for instance, our example with, for instance, Chris Paul is Montrezl Harrell in the long run might be a better player, but it's going to be very similar to Grant Hill and Ben Wallace, where Chris Paul has been injured and is older and might never be back, whereas Montrezl Harrell is young and improving. That might happen, but even then, right, they got a finals run essentially out of Chris Paul, and they were one healthy game from Chris Paul away from being in the NBA Finals, probably the NBA champions last season.
And I love you putting it that way, because let's pretend like we're an ownership group, Dre, of an NBA team, and we're evaluating our front office, and we're saying, do we want to give them another contract, or how much we want to pay them and whatnot. And I think that probably is the metric we should use, which is championship runs, right? And that's why we liked the Chris Paul deal, is even though they were overpaying him, we thought that that deal would lead to a championship run for the Houston Rockets last season. I'm sorry, this season. I'm conflating two things. After they did it last season, we thought it would lead to another one this season, right? And that's all you want to try to do, is you want to say, we want to put the team in a position to win, and the Rockets were inches away from winning a title last year. So great job on the Rockets leading up to that, right? As far as Anthony Davis goes, I'm with you. Like, in terms of access journalism, and we're not going to get into Trump today, but that's a big topic there as well. And, it's like, do you provide all the context as a reporter, or do you report it the way that, your sources will want you to in order to maintain the access? And that is kind of the journalistic question here, and it's always a tough one. I still am okay with talking about this just because it's Anthony Davis. And you were talking about real world scenarios, like if you were actually an NBA team, who would you not offer up for him? And I pretty much agree with you. And I looked at it as a fantasy scenario, right? Like, and what I mean by that is, if you're in some hypothetical world where you can pick one player in the NBA to be on your team on a supermax deal, for the next 5 years, would you take anyone over Anthony Davis? And I can't think of too many people I would take, right? Yeah, maybe Giannis, maybe Jokic, Gobert, or Simmons. Those are maybe the only four I could think of. I wouldn't put Doncic even in there yet. I haven't seen enough from him, but maybe he'll be there by the end of the year. But but let's look at some of the current greats. Harden, Steph Curry, Durant. Those guys are too old. I'd rather have, for the next 5 years anyway, Anthony Davis than them. So this is, whenever he does end up moving, it's going to be very significant. And that's kind of going to be a big question coming up over the next few weeks is, all this, just to finish up, I'll let you get in after this, Dre. All this was initiated by Anthony Davis and his agents, right? And, tampering aside, maybe LeBron, who knows, but the point is, the Pelicans did not want this to happen. And so now they have to decide, are we going to, keep him here for the rest of the year and try to trade him during the offseason? Or are we going to try to trade him now? And yeah, I'll let you get in, but there's a lot of reasons to do it all those ways.
I was going to say the fascinating player is Kawhi Leonard. Someone asked me, I'll try and get this as well, basically was asking about if there has ever been a player that, okay, so let's see. I believe it's Miles Grant. A good example of a small market team that is well run losing out on a star player. Because, for instance, the great example I'll give you is Paul George. Everybody said Paul George was just going to be a rental for OKC. He went to OKC. They did pretty well. They look really promising for the future. He's like, they can offer me the most money, and they love me here. I'm going to stay in OKC, right? That's what ended up happening here. The difference between him and I would say Kevin Durant is the moves they made. Like, we actually applauded a lot of the moves they made. We like things like Nerlens Noel. I think maybe he learned his lesson with Carmelo Anthony. I think most NBA stars were like, yeah, Carmelo Anthony's going to help out. And he's like, oh, that was a mistake. So anyway, he stuck around, and the only player I can really think of is Kawhi Leonard, who was on a small market, well-run team that ran, and that was your issue. Kevin Durant obviously ran, but of course the Oklahoma City Thunder were poorly managed, and I think I really liked the Oladipo signing back in the day, but I think it was too little too late at that point. I think he was basically going, I don't know if I believe that they can get me a title. I'm 99.9% certain Golden State can get me a title. Was 100% right too. So that being said, it's kind of going how happy they're going to be and all of that. and I'm not 100% sure. So we'll have to see an Anthony Davis. But that question was thrown out there, and it's really just funny to see people arguing about this being a bad thing, because traditionally, if a small market is well run, they get to keep the player, and New Orleans has just not been well run.
Yeah, and you mentioned Kawhi Leonard. He may end up being a counterexample to that, as well as being an example. And what I mean by that is, if he ends up staying in Toronto, despite saying he didn't want to go there originally, it could happen, right? They could make a finals run or even win the finals this season, and he might stay there instead of, going to the Clippers or the Lakers.
If you're really unhappy, like we've seen this with, say, Dwight Howard back in the day, arguably Kevin Durant, LeBron James in Cleveland, where you're really unhappy, it's easy to leave millions of dollars on the table to go elsewhere to chase a ring. But if you're happy, I've said this before, right? I think Chris Paul is set up. I was looking this up today, Brian. He's going to be making over $40 million a year in 3 seasons. That contract is not going to age well if he doesn't come back.
He's still fairly young, but yeah, I agree.
He's going to be making over $40 million a year, and if a team holds your rights, they can offer, like with Kawhi, they can offer him, I think, 5 years. I've never had to tell someone no to $40 million. I'd have to be really, really, really angry not to. And, they have Tim Hortons up in – I like Toronto. I got to go there on a business trip once, and it's a fun place. So – he'd have to really hate Toronto to say no, but we'll definitely see what happens. You brought up some good research on this, which is to say there are a lot of sticking points in what might happen with Anthony Davis. The first is, if the Celtics are the two names showing up.
I want to give some credit here, Dre. This is we've been mentioning him a lot lately, so I guess I've been considering him writing good articles. But this is Tom Haberstroh gave these 3 reasons why they may wait to trade him instead of trading him now.
So the first is, I guess the Celtics have a designated player, which they used on Kyrie Irving, which means that they're not allowed to sign Anthony Davis the same way to the same contract, so they have to wait to trade for him if they want him to be their designated player. So they couldn't trade for Anthony Davis this season if they want to. In terms of going to the Lakers...
Well, sort of. So for the Celtics, they could trade him to the Celtics, but only if they trade away Kyrie Irving.
Oh, so they can't have both on the –
okay, they can't have both on the team at once. So they could say, we'll give you Kyrie Irving for Anthony Davis. That's a possibility. However, I've been reading some reporting that the Celtics do not want to do that. They want to instead try to pair the two of them together later in the offseason.
Just give Kyrie –
It's Picasso, right? Just do it.
Yeah, okay. So there's that. There's additionally that if he's going to the Lakers, Lonzo Ball might be one of the players required, and he's hurt right now. Although there's like a funny theory, and I remember hearing this like preseason too, similar notions on kind of conspiracy theories, is maybe they're saying Lonzo Ball is hurt right now, so he's not on the table for the trade.
Yeah.
Same thing. And then the other argument he's making, this one seems the most outlandish to me. He's saying if they want to try and draft Zion, they can wait to see who gets the number 1 pick and basically try and offer up Anthony Davis for that. I don't think any team is going to say okay to that, because even in that case, if they get Zion and Anthony Davis wants to go there, they can just say, just stick out your year or Kawhi it up and sit, and we'll see you in a season. Because that for the record was like, we noted this about Carmelo Anthony, who we did say was a mistake to go to the Knicks. But if they wanted Carmelo Anthony, they could have just waited half a season and signed him outright in free agency. But they traded all of their young assets for him. Now, annoyingly, their young assets, Wilson Chandler and Danilo Gallinari, didn't stay healthy, unfortunately, so we never got to see what that would look like. But it's like you would much rather have had a squad with Jason Kidd, Danilo, Carmelo, Tyson Chandler than a team without those players. So if a team is lucking into Zion as well as having a shot at Anthony Davis, they might just tell Anthony Davis, just stay put. We'd rather have 4 years of you and Zion next to each other than have 1 year of just, 1 extra year of you.
Yeah, and I can see that happening. I think the way it was being presented in that article was something effective. Well, if a first-round pick is not like the last piece that will put the trade over the top, if that first-round pick happens to be Zion Williamson, that would be the extra, amount that would do it. But you're explanation sounds right to me. That being said, teams don't always make smart choices.
Now, you put this on the script, which I really liked, which is, I believe unless something weird is going on, the Pelicans are still in the playoff run. And our argument is they've got no shot of getting anything equal back. That's always amusing to us. We would say to them, they go up to Anthony Davis and they say, you know what? This is what we would do. If we like magically got control of the front office, we'd say, this front office has been a joke. This front office has been a travesty.
Rip in peace, Still Damps. Yeah, go ahead.
He drafted Austin Rivers with a top 10 pick after you. I kind of want to go look at that draft, but I don't have time right now, Brian. But I'm sure there were some good names that we would have liked.
Yeah, Draymond Green is one of those names.
So Draymond Green.
He went the second round in that draft.
Okay. Austin Rivers was terrible. One of my favorites. I just dropped his name, which makes me feel really bad. Bricado. But James Bricado wrote an article how Austin Rivers was like the worst prospect in the draft. He was good at nothing in college. So it's like they're like, we wasted a top 10 pick on Austin Rivers. We signed terrible players. We're the team that traded away. I think I looked up the Chris Paul trade. Here's an amusing part. The Chris Paul trade by the New Orleans Pelicans included Austin Rivers and Eric Gordon. So I find it amusing that Austin Rivers, Eric Gordon, and Chris Paul are all on the Rockets. I think the Rockets should offer Chris Paul, Austin Rivers, and Eric Gordon for Anthony Davis. That would be hilarious. So, they could say we've made bad trades. We've signed bad players. We're getting a little better, right? We really like Julius Randle, so he looks good.
They trade for Mirotic. That ended up okay.
We like the Mirotic. We like the Cousins trade. We like the Mirotic. So the last couple of seasons, they've been doing okay. We could say we're doing better. We got a season and a half of you. We're in the playoff hunt. Let's do as good as we can in the next 2 seasons. And then, we're going to offer you the max because obviously you're going to be in your prime. If you don't want to resign with us, great. But we are going to do our best to go far in the playoffs the next 2 seasons. That's what we would do because we've been saying this forever. Like, I don't even know. I really would love to get updated numbers. Making a round of the playoffs is worth millions of dollars, if not more, including legacy to your team. Every playoff game your team is in is a legacy that your fans can look back on in the future. So it makes more sense to build a legacy and go for a title with Anthony Davis, who is a prerequisite. You cannot win a title without a player of Anthony Davis's caliber. We have never seen it happen. Now, admittedly, sometimes those players are underrated. Sometimes those players are like Dennis Rodman's or Ben Wallace's, but you can't do it without an Anthony Davis. So we'd say just go for it. That's what our argument would be, is say, try as hard as you can, go as far as you can in the playoffs, make millions of dollars every round of the playoffs you're in. And that if Anthony Davis wants to leave, Anthony Davis wants to leave. You are not going to get anything back. That has never happened. All of the major names that have been traded in recent history, the teams that got anything back from it was nowhere near close. So that's our take on this.
And you're right. I agree with all that. And it's tough, though, because we have a very recent example of this in Jimmy Butler, right?
Oh, and I was going to say Kawhi.
Yeah, and Kawhi also, but Jimmy Butler even more recent. And what did we say in both those cases? They should just hold on to that player and try to win and, see what happens. But they weren't able to do that, right? And Chris Haynes also, he writes for Yahoo, great insider. He said something against that, which I agree with to some extent too, which is, are you just going to let him sit there and, all the other players on the team basically are going to be mad at you for that because you're not moving on, right? It's like you're holding the franchise in stasis and time, all while eroding the perception of your franchise. So, yeah, it's a tough question, and but maybe they should wait, but I don't know if they're going to be able to.
There's one last point I'm going to give this Anthony Davis thing, which is, I think, important, is he is saying the line, I want to go to a well-run team and have a shot at a title. And there's a good chance he's going to end up in LA, and people are going to say, what are you talking about, right? That wasn't your best bet. It was the same what we were saying with LeBron James this offseason. If he wanted a best bet at a title, my thought was, go to Philadelphia, right? That made the most sense to me. He went to Los Angeles. You have always been the one that astutely notes this, Brian, and it's good. I like having it in the back of my head. I'm glad that you've kind of put this forefront in my head when I think about it.
Brainwashed you.
Fair enough. Where you have to say certain things when you're on camera. You have to look at the players say. And so Anthony Davis is currently saying the right thing. We look at players. You brought up a Kevin Durant quote that's bizarre and stupid. Love you, Kevin. Kevin Durant's amazing at basketball. He's horrible at talking. Where he was saying, why does this matter? Who cares? It's not anything like the shutdown. It's like, you're in the business of sport, dude. This is the thing. But anyway,
I think he's kind of projecting there. He's wishing, because he's a private guy, he's wishing he didn't get asked about all this stuff all the time. I think that's what he's really saying.
That being said, just with Anthony, I completely forgot where I was going with that. But with Anthony,
do you want me to read the quote out?
Yeah.
So he says, he was asked, are the players in the locker room on the Warriors talking about Anthony Davis demanding this trade? And his reply was, it's definitely a topic of conversation. All NBA is news. I mean, it's not that serious, so why not talk about it? So AD wanting to play basketball somewhere else, it's not like the president shutting down the government. It's just basketball, so of course we talk about it. We all, as players, we want guys to do exactly what they want to do in this league. We have a short amount of time, so why not do what you want? And that second part, of course, is the part I liked and why I put on the script. But I think the first part of it is the part you thought was ridiculous. Yeah, I agree.
I'm going to say, I'm going to give him credit, actually. That middle part was kind of weird, but I actually agree with this take that he had. So I apologize, Kevin Durant. That I should not critique anybody else for odd tangents in the middle of otherwise cohesive thoughts. So apologies, Kevin Durant. Full credit for that point. And what all I was just going to say is, when we look at what happens with Anthony Davis, it might be tempting to say, oh, bullshit, he said he wanted to play for a contender, but he ended up on the Clippers. He is in PR mode right now, which means just say what you need to say to get what you need to get done. And who knows what's going to happen.
Yeah, and if this does end up going down the road of tampering, I think it's worth pointing out that tampering is just dumb. Players and agents should just be able to talk to who they want and make these teams, right? And this is what we're trying to boil down in this Kevin Durant comment, right? Is traditionally it's been these rich, billionaire owners dictating where everyone goes, and now these younger black players are starting to gain more power, and this is one of those examples.
I'll just say one last point, one capper on this, and that'll be our show, is basically the NBA created this issue with the tampering thing because Anthony Davis, I think this is way outdated. Back in the day, I believe Dave Barry wrote an article that said LeBron James would be worth $50 million, and it was based on a quote by Dwayne Wade, because I think people were asking Dwayne Wade what he should be paid, and he said I guess if it was a fair league, I'd make $50 million. The NBA has a max contract for star players, and it's also seniority based. So the fact that Anthony Davis is only entering his second contract means he's actually cheaper than players like Chris Paul.
Yeah.
They capped that, and then we saw Magic Johnson got fined $100,000 or something, or even if it was more, maybe it was $250,000, which would be one of the biggest fines ever, for talking about Paul George with how well Paul George is playing. Had they gotten Paul George, they'd be paying him $30 million a year, somewhere around that. $250,000 as a signing bonus is nothing. To get us back to baseball, I'm forgetting the player's name, but way back in the day, not super far back, a decade, the Boston Red Sox wanted a star Japanese pitcher, and they paid $10 million plus to the Japanese team he was on for the right to negotiate with it.
Is the posting fee or whatever they call it? It's a deal between leagues, right?
Yeah, and I mean, this is, for instance, the reason why when we look at players in the NCAA and FIBA, they have to enter the NBA through the draft, because all of these leagues have agreements that say if you play for the NCAA, you're not allowed to enter the NBA unless you go through the draft. If you play for FIBA, you're not allowed to enter the NBA unless you go via the draft. So there are agreements between leagues that say, if these players want to negotiate with each other, if you want our player, you have to do X. And that was, for instance, a case with Ricky Rubio back in the day. He waited a season to come into the NBA because they would have had to have bought out his contract with his squad. But yeah, so Paul George is making $30 million a season. If you get fined $250,000 for tampering, but you still end up with Paul George, that's, you were calling it the posting fee, less than a posting fee for this. And the same thing with Anthony Davis with any tampering. If a team wants him, he is worth more than 50, not just more than 50 million. That's old CBA, new CBA, baby. He's worth maybe over 100 million. For F's sakes, a couple $100,000 for tampering is completely worth it. And it's because the NBA maxed their max players. If they didn't max their max players, then it would be much harder for a team to come in and offer Anthony Davis what he's worth, to pry him away from the Pelicans, because it's kind of on them. So to your point on tampering, not only is it like a ridiculous rule, if they don't want it to be an issue, they shouldn't have it set up so that it's a trivial fine to get fined for tampering.
I love you describing that way, because what I suspect, the function of this rule then ends up being is like, so if you think about what are the NBA rules, really, it's just an agreement between these 30 billionaires, right, for whatever they want to do. So they'll tolerate tampering from the richer teams as long as they just pay a little bit of money, but then they have this public wrist slap, that it doesn't want to happen. So tampering just kind of seems like a political thing between owners to me, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, if I had any shout outs, I think I gave them out. I didn't watch, you have some Royal Rumble comments, but I didn't even watch it and I don't care.
We can just skip it. Yeah. Nia Jax was in the men's Royal Rumble. That's about it. Let's move on.
Let's let you get your shout outs and that'll be our show.
Yes, I do have a few shout-outs. The first is to Andre Iguodala, who turned 35 years old today. He is one of my favorite players, and I believe yours as well. One of those, Hall of Fame player who does not score a lot of points and is having one of his best seasons ever at age 35. He's played over 1,000 minutes, too, so far, so he's looking great. Great player. And my other shout-out is to Bill Walton.
That does look like Bill Walton.
It turns out that he acted in Ghostbusters. You can see, in 1984 Ghostbusters, you can see him clearly in the movie, and he was in the credits, and no one knew about it until he trolled his broadcasting partner Dave Pasch the other night.
It's amazing
about it.
I know Ron Jeremy is in there, and then this was a funny behind the scenes story. I know they actually did shut down parts of New York to film Ghostbusters. And I think it's Asimov. I think Asimov lived down there.
Isaac Asimov, the science fiction writer.
Yes. And then I think actually, I believe one of the ghosts, I think I'm getting this right off to look up to see if it's 100% accurate. But I think Dan Aykroyd was a fan and wanted to get an autograph. And he was like, are you the reason that this downtown is shut down? And he's like, yeah. And he said, fuck off or something. So there's lots of funny, because it's in New York. It was filmed in New York.
Yeah.
Lots of famous names. So that is an amazing. Man, when Reddit does things good, it does things good. That's awesome.
It's just so funny to see him there. You could clearly see him, but if you weren't looking for him, you wouldn't see it.
All right, the invisible gorilla. All right, so that's been our show. If you found us not through the website, we are at boxscoregeeks.com, and apparently I also am back to writing at nerdnumbers.com, depending on which interface is better to write at. We go live every week, twitch.tv/nerdnumbers. Usually Mondays around 9:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If we ever get a more regular time, we will start tweeting it out, but we're not there yet. You can catch recaps at the show, channel Nerd Numbers on YouTube, and then, of course, we have the podcast itself on iTunes and Stitcher, the Boxscore Geek Show. I'm your host, Ray Alvarez, a.k.a. Nerd Numbers, co-host Brian Foster, a.k.a. Boxscore Brian. Hope you have a good week, and that's all we got.